Good morning, everybody. I'm John Lewis. I'm a retired New Hampshire Superior Court judge, and I'm here today, August 23, 2022, in the Supreme Court's Souter Conference Room to interview attorney Peter J. Loughlin. Now, whenever one considers New Hampshire's law on land use and municipal matters, Peter's name comes right to the forefront. Peter started his legal career, and he'll talk about this himself, in New Hampshire's legal assistance program going back into the late 1960s. And then he served as Portsmouth's city attorney and city prosecutor for a number of years in the 1970s. And then in 1977 and going to 2020, Peter maintained an impressive private land use and municipal law practice representing many towns and indeed cities, and upward to 65 to 75 of them, as well as representing many private landowners. He's litigated many important land use cases and other type cases, and many went to the Supreme Court, New Hampshire Supreme Court. Peter is also very significantly the author of a very heavily used and relied upon New Hampshire practice manuals, 2 volumes dealing with local government law and single volumes for zoning and planning and municipal taxation and road law. And of course, Peter has been heavily involved in his own seacoast community and Portsmouth, and we'll be talking about that as well. So good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Judge.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to see you and to be able to interview you. So let's get started and let's talk about your early years. You and I have talked about that. You were born in 1944 in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Your father and mother, your father was Thomas and your mother was Mary Rafferty. And they, I think your father worked at the shipyard.
He was a welder at the shipyard.
And your mother worked in a teaching kind of capacity.
She graduated from the Portsmouth Normal School, which was the process then, a 2-year
But
school.
neither of them completed 4 years of college.
No.
And you yourself, you went to St. Patrick's School from grades 1 to 8.
Right.
And then Portsmouth High School.
Right.
Where you graduated in 1962.
Right.
And you lived in, I think, Essex Avenue.
Yes, that's correct.
A 3-bedroom place where you and your, I think you had several siblings.
2 sisters and a brother.
Now, all living in that small house, right?
Yes.
So describe to us a bit your upbringing in Portsmouth. I know that was in the 60s, I guess, and maybe in the 50s.
And 60s.
So what was Portsmouth like back then?
I think it was a delightful place. Of course, I wasn't downtown in the beer joints maybe at midnight, but and it, with the shipyard, with the Navy Yard sailors and the Air Force people, I guess it could be fairly rough. But that was, for the most part, it was a pretty calm place, and a nice place to grow up.
And tell us a little bit about Portsmouth High School back then.
It was, I think, about 300 students in the class, probably 25% from the air base. And so it was a pretty diverse student body. Always had, I thought, high-quality teachers, and it was a very good high school.
So you came out of there feeling like you could go to college, right?
Yeah, I guess I did.
So you went to Merrimack College,
I did.
correct? Tell us about that.
My brother had gone to Holy Cross, my sister graduated from Emmanuel, and I guess I was looking at maybe a small Catholic college nearby, and Merrimack fit the bill, and Best part of it, I had great teachers, but best part, I met my wife there.
And she's Nancy
Yes,
Hall.
yes.
And you didn't marry immediately, but you did marry.
Right, about 6 years after we graduated.
So you became a history major back then, right?
Yes.
And once you graduated from Merrimack College, went on to law school, correct?
That's correct.
So tell us about that. You went to Notre Dame in Indiana, right?
I did, and I'm somewhat of a fluke. And you might think, well, an Irish Catholic, that's the Mecca, you'd naturally go there, but I never gave it a thought. There was a scholarship from Merrimack for a Merrimack student to go to Suffolk, and I was told I could have that. And but I happened to talk one day to the law school advisor, and I said, I'm thinking about going to law school. And he was reading this paper, and he said, well, come back after you take some test. And it wasn't the LSAT, it was some other test. And I said, well, actually, I did take it already. He said, well, how'd you do? And I said, I told him the mark, it was like in the 97%. And he runs up outside, takes a bulletin off the bulletin board, and hands it to me. You need to go there. It was for Notre Dame. And he said, you know, having a score like that is like having Gale Sayers' legs, who was a big running back for the Chicago Bears at the time, which I always thought I'd probably look strange with Gale Sayers' legs. But so I, as a result, I applied. And to this day, I am convinced that that score in the 97th percentile was a mistake, because the really bright kids in my class did terrible on that test. And so I think the scores got mixed up somehow, because there was nothing in my law school career that showed I had some particular aptitude for studying law. But anyway, I was probably the only one from New Hampshire that applied, and they all want to show they have great diversity, geographic diversity. So I got in, and it was I enjoyed Notre Dame.
So what years were you there?
66 to 69.
And do you recall some particularly good professors that you want to mention here?
Well, probably one of the ones I enjoyed the most was named Blakey, and who had written the RICO law when he was in the Senate committee, and testified all over on that. And he also taught criminal law, taught a 1-year, 2-semester property course, which I didn't like. And we had 2 weeks.
That's kind of ironic.
Well, it's even more ironic. We had 2 weeks of land use law, which I absolutely hated. And so that was the last thing I would ever think about was land use law. So things work out other than you plan.
Well, so you graduate in 1969, and there you are in Indiana. So why come back to New Hampshire?
I guess ultimately that was always something I wanted to be able to do. And it worked out pretty well.
So you come back, and what's your first job, and how did you get that job?
Well, I was going to be, I'd signed up to be a VISTA volunteer. For 2 years, I was supposed to go to Minneapolis, and my family in September had a going away party for me, but the airline tickets from Boston to Minneapolis never showed up. And I happened to run into John McEachern someplace, and he said, hey, Legal Aid is hiring. Well, that's probably pretty much the same as VISTA, and I had an interview and got hired.
So John McEachern was a lawyer in Portsmouth at the time,
right,
with his brother Paul and his other brother Duncan.
Right.
And so you knew them.
Yes.
And so he suggested New Hampshire legal assistance. So did you follow up on that?
I did, and was in Keene for a year, and then in Portsmouth for a year.
So let's talk about Keene for a second there. So what was your experience there? How would you describe it?
I don't want to use the word magical, but I was like adopted. I'm a 26-year-old kid, had never been in court. I didn't really know any judges. I mean, any lawyers. I mean, knew the McEachrons, but I mean, not, long-term relationship with any lawyers. And the lawyers, I don't know, it's a small bar, but Peter Aspios, for one, became the probate judge. Jack Zimmerman and George Hanna. I mean, I could go into any one of those offices and say, how do you do this? How do you do that? Because I was by myself in that office in Keene. And the clerk's office, Charlie Contis was the clerk, and Marion Hodges, who did one of these interviews, was there for 6. I mean, to be able to go in and say, how do you do this or whatever, it was, to be treated that way as this fresh kid out of law school, it was pretty amazing. And
you actually argued one case during that time in front of the New Hampshire Supreme Court, right?
I did.
The Courier versus Tuck case.
Right.
What was that about?
A siding case. Classic, guys come to this elderly woman's home and convince her she should have siding, and she signs a blank mortgage, and they start to foreclose when she missed a payment. And my predecessor at Legal Aid, Richard Dashbar, had actually brought the case, and I tried it in front of Judge Dunphy in Sullivan County, and then it went to the Supreme Court, and it was a consumer protection case, and it was pretty satisfying that you could really change someone's life. It was pretty neat. And I remember coming to the old Supreme Court building with Judge Kennison, and that was quite an experience with the fireplace and how welcoming I felt there as a pretty young guy.
Did they ask you some hard questions?
I don't remember that. I'm sure they did, and I probably didn't have the answers. Maybe that's why I put it out of my mind.
Well, you were at Keene from about October 1969 to October of 1970, and then moved to Portsmouth. How did that happen?
John Marr had been the legal aid lawyer in Portsmouth, and I think he left to go to the Shane's office, and so there was an opening here, and I thought, well, I kind of would like to be back in Portsmouth, so I transferred over to Portsmouth.
And then you were there for about a year. What kind of work did you do in Portsmouth?
We did some consumer protection, but an awful lot of domestic stuff at that time, which was pretty wearing on
what do you mean by domestic?
Domestic relations cases, divorce, and
even for legal assistance?
Oh, at that time,
Really?
time, and that was changed after that. And but at that point, legal assistants did a lot of individual divorce cases.
Well, you were there for about 1 year, and then you became Portsmouth's city attorney and city prosecutor in 1971. How did that happen?
Out of the blue, I got a call from the city manager, Calvin Canny, and he said, we're thinking about having a full-time city attorney. Would you be interested? Well, I didn't know a variance from an abatement, and but I was ready to get out of legal aid. I was kind of worn down from that, and I went over, and they had to appropriate the money, I guess, at the city council, and it was just, I always wonder why. I asked Calvin Candy years later, in fact, not that many years ago, I said, well, why did you ever hire me? You didn't know anything about me. And he said, well, I knew that you were a local boy, and I didn't think you'd want to embarrass your parents. And he said, I knew you went to Notre Dame, so I thought maybe you had some morals. And he just didn't think you were the kind of guy that would shoot his mouth off. And I thought he was going to say, I was hoping he'd say, I heard you were a really good lawyer, kind of quick on your feet, and very cerebral. But no, he didn't think I'd want to embarrass my parents. So that was good enough, I guess. But anyway, it started me on quite a path that I never anticipated. Certainly not in my property course at Notre Dame.
So you were there from 1971 to 77 and learned a bit about land use and municipal law, did you not?
It was pretty hard not to. I was by myself, and so you tried every case, and yeah, it was, and to be given that opportunity to handle these cases at a young age was pretty remarkable.
What kind of cases would you be handling, would you say?
Every appeal from a planning board, you advised the planning board and the zoning board, but you handled every appeal from those boards. You handled all the tax abatement matters and just everything. You advised every department, anything that came up.
Now, you drafted some ordinances during that time. Why don't you tell us about that?
We drafted the first historic district ordinance. And in 1974, because I remember drafting it the weekend after my father's funeral, and we got it, and the council adopted it, the first reading the next Monday, and the timing was important because one building, the downtown, a very classy building, was, if we hadn't done it that day, the owner was planning to tear it down, went into for a demolition permit. But anyway, it had a major difference in effect in Portsmouth. And of course, all the realtors in the Chamber of Commerce fought it. It was going to be the end of Portsmouth. And of course, after a couple of years, every real estate ad says, "Oh, in the historic district." And but it was not welcomed by. Fortunately, we had 5 votes on the. I shouldn't say we. The city had 5 votes on the city council that passed it. So that was.
Well, if you walk through Portsmouth today, you see so many interesting buildings and houses that go back years.
Yeah.
And that comes from preservation of those places, right?
And it was sort of what the tipping point was reached when 3 or 4 different banks wanted to put in drive-in tellers, and 4 relatively significant buildings, red brick buildings downtown, were torn down, and people started to think, we better watch what we're doing. And there had been the librarian Dorothy Vaughan, who really was very instrumental in starting Strawberry Bank, had been talking for years about preserving buildings, but this was the first time the city really got involved in it.
And you were also the city prosecutor,
I was.
So you would appear in front of Judge Flynn, or is that right?
Yes. For 7 years, and I loved that part of the job. I loved working with the police, and you usually win. And
was there another ordinance that you also drafted?
Yeah, the first growth control ordinance in the state. And Portsmouth was experiencing, like a lot of communities in the 70s and 80s, some phenomenal growth. And it was a matter of just trying to regulate the timing of it. And I think it worked out pretty well.
Now, you started getting pretty heavily involved with the Bar Association, the New Hampshire Bar Association, and particularly their municipal and government law section during that period of time. Is that right?
That's right.
So talk to us about that.
Well, Dan Crean is the one that really started it. He was with the Municipal Association, and we would have meetings once a month, and there weren't that many, probably still aren't an awful lot of people that do a lot of municipal law. And so it was a great opportunity to get together with people the very few people that did that. I mean, there may be a dozen or so at the most. And so it was very, very helpful. And there wasn't a municipal lawyer, probably not a lawyer in the state, that I couldn't call up and say, hey, how do you do this? What do you do on something like that? And I've tried to, over the years, repay that, knowing that I learned how to practice law by calling people on the phone, not having partners. Plus, I had the benefit of, a lot of lawyers in Portsmouth that were so good to me, and particularly Jerry Giles was a municipal court judge, and who was just very, very helpful. And I mean, I hesitate to list them because there were so many that Jerry Waldron, all of the lawyers were very, very helpful to me.
That
and I would run.
collegiality, that collegiality is so important.
It was, and and I would run every day at noontime. There were probably upwards of 6 or 7 of us that ran over to Newcastle, and that was a great time to get questions answered, and without people being away from, called away from the work.
Well, you started to become a lecturer and speaker about these issues, municipal law and land use law. Is that right?
Yeah, yes. I think it was some regional planner had first invited me, and I think it was in Twin Mountain or someplace. And but I kind of liked it, and then there weren't that many people that had the benefit of the kind of experience that I had at a
So
pretty
when
young
did it
age.
turn around for you? When did you start to like land use law and, in particular?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I think maybe when I got to be familiar with it, and yeah, because it was quite a change from the stuff in the. I can still picture the textbook we had. I threw it out fairly recently, actually. But yeah, at some point, obviously, I came to actually like it.
Well, it's the heart and soul of New Hampshire law in many ways, isn't it?
Well, it's been a good area for me. I enjoyed it.
Well, you eventually go into private practice by yourself, I think,
Yes.
in 1977.
Right.
What led to that? What prompted that?
I've been there for 7 years, and I'd see other lawyers opening up of going into private practice or starting practice, and I started thinking, at some point I think I'd like to go out on my own, try it.
Why not join a firm? Why do you do it single practice?
I almost joined a firm, and I had an elderly neighbor who was a plumber, and I remember just talking to him and saying I was thinking about joining this firm. He said, and they had made me an offer, and he said, "Don't be crazy. They're only making you an offer because they want you to make money for them. You can make money for yourself." And that probably wasn't the greatest investigation to go into private practice, but I did, and I, right from the beginning, had the benefit of towns from the lecturing calling, and it worked out well.
So you opened your office in Portsmouth, right?
Yes.
Where was that located?
It was down at Strawberry Bank in Daniel Webster's home, which is pretty neat. And I used to think that none of his eloquence ever rubbed off, but I never quite developed the same drinking habits that Daniel allegedly have. So I thought it worked out all right.
So upward to 65 to 75 towns and cities used you at different points.
Yes, yes.
And other people as well.
Yes.
And was your practice fairly much focused in on land use matters and municipal matters?
All municipal matters. I mean, at the beginning I did some different things. I think I tried one, after prosecuting for all those years, I tried one DWI defense, and I just didn't believe my client, and I thought, I'm not very good at this. But it was almost exclusively municipal related, well, the tax matters, or mostly zoning, I suppose, or whatever the problems municipalities get into.
So you gave me a list of some of the cases that you argued in the Supreme Court, and the list numbers 20. You had 20 cases at least in your career, and some of them, one of them was that Courier versus Tuck case, which goes back to your legal assistance days. But why don't we talk about what kind of, I ask you, I think, could you identify 3 strong cases in your career that went to the Supreme Court that had dealt with land use to discuss? So let's do that. I think you mentioned the Simplex case, the first one, right?
The Simplex, because you were talking about impactful cases. Well, it was impactful because I lost it. We actually, I tried it in the Superior Court in front of Judge Galway for 3 days, back when there used to be full trials, not the 15-minute thing. And Hank Stebbins was on the other side, and now Justice Hans Marconi was on the other side. And we tried it for 3 days, had a view, and got a great decision from Judge Galway, and went to the Supreme Court, and somebody couldn't sit, and so Judge Horton sat. He had already retired, but before he retired, he wrote an opinion saying this variance standard in New Hampshire is crazy, and so he didn't write the opinion. At least Judge Netto wrote the opinion, Justice Netto. And they were right. The law was if you had any reasonable use of your property, you couldn't get a variance. And so they changed it to I can't tell you, recite what they are, the three reasons now why you can get a variance. And it was time, it needed to be changed. Now, I'd seen Judge Galway afterwards, and he said, yeah, we both know that it needed to be changed, but why did they have to pick on our case to do it? And so that worked out. So that was maybe not the the result I wanted, but it was an impactful case. And I did look at I made that list of 20 cases. I have never gone back on Lexis to see how many cases I've had, and I was kind of surprised. I didn't know, and I thought in my head that, I was pretty successful in the Supreme Court. That was what I've never really looked at the cases, but I think I had a pretty good record up there. Well, when I actually look at the cases, it wasn't quite as good as I had recalled it being.
Well, what about Casuli versus Redden?
Well, that was I don't know whether you call it a strong case, but it meant a lot to me. It was, Redden was an electrical inspector in Portsmouth, and there was a fire in a restaurant, and he said to him, before you reopen, you have to make certain changes, and to the electrical, and they ignored him. So he issued an order, maybe to public service or whatever, and they shut him down. He lost his insurance, and so they had another fire, and so they sued him. And at that time, there's no insurance counsel. Most towns didn't have insurance counsel. So I tried it, filed a motion to dismiss. We had a hearing over in Rockingham and got it dismissed. And then I went to the Supreme Court, and it was a lesson that I learned from that case. And this inspector was kind of an elderly guy, although he was younger than I am now. I saw him someplace on the street, and he was kind of a gruff guy, and he said, "How's my case going?" And I said, "Oh, it's going, this is just pending." And I said, "Oh, it's fine, I wouldn't worry about it." And he said, "Of course you wouldn't worry about it, it's not your $100,000. And I thought, that's a good lesson, because, we as lawyers, I think, it was just another case. Well, it's not just another case to the person that, but the case, there was something neat about it. I just looked up that case on Sunday afternoon, and I didn't remember that Ray Blanchard had argued it. And in a sense, Ray had kind of bookended my legal career in that in 1969, I passed the bar in August, and I had worked for 4 summers as a union laborer when I was 50 years younger and 40 pounds heavier. But I was working I'd got the word that I passed the bar, but I was still working construction because I was going to go into Vista in September. And I was working a sewer job for Harvey Construction at the shipyard. And I remember coming up, I have a vivid recollection, coming up out of a sewer manhole, and this big black Cadillac of Ray's was stopped. Well, I don't even know how I knew who he was, but, and Steve Toba, future bar president, were in the car. Now, I saw that they had stopped to ask somebody else on the job directions. And I'm sure they didn't notice me. I mean, why would they notice some guy coming out of a manhole? But I thought it was funny because, not funny, but interesting for a small town that 10 years later, Ray and I are arguing that case against each other up here in Concord. And for the last 10 years, I have been had the opportunity to visit Ray on a pretty regular basis. He's in a nursing home in Portsmouth, dealing with some issues, and I just and kind of the uniqueness of a small town practice, and the other thing that I had forgotten about, the guy that I represented retired not too long after, and his friends gave him a pewter bowl with his name on it and some dates, and he had that taken down, had my name put on it, and he dedicated it to me. And I thought, well, that's pretty special.
That's nice.
I mean, it really was special, and I don't know that happens everywhere in bigger places, but it happened there, and it was pretty special.
Well, Ray Blanchard was one of the prominent Portsmouth attorneys of
Yeah.
his day, and the Casuli case is in 118 New Hampshire, and the Simplex case is 145 New Hampshire. So what's the third case we're going to talk about?
Third case, and you had said 3 strong cases. I don't know how strong any of them were, but and none of those cases changed the course of world history. I'm kind of aware of that. But an interesting case I thought was Merrill versus Manchester that was on the list, and I was only involved in the rehearing part of it. And in 1974, John Pelleton and from Dave Nixon's office had challenged the law concerning municipal immunity. And at that time, the law was if something was a governmental, there was a distinction made between a governmental function and a proprietary function. So as municipal lawyers, whenever somebody brought a claim against the city, it would say, oh, that's a governmental function, we have immunity. And the plaintiff's bar would say, oh no, it's a proprietary function of the town. Well, the distinction got to be harder and harder to make. And so anyway, Dave Nixon's office challenged it. The Supreme Court in the first Merrill case ruled that no, that distinction doesn't make sense anymore. And Duncan wrote a concurring opinion saying, I hate to do this, but we told the legislature 8 years ago to change the law, and they didn't do it. So
and this appears in 114 New Hampshire.
Right, right. So we went, I was only involved in the rehearing. Bob Shanes had brought a case against the city. We got it dismissed, and he appealed it, so that was pending. So I was just up there to try to say, don't make it retroactive, which they did. And actually, Norm Stahl and Claudia Damon were arguing the same position I was, and if you get Claudia Damon and Norm Stahl arguing your position, you'd probably just say, hey, I want what they want, and sit down. But actually, Norm Stahl was interim city attorney in Concord. I'm sure just doing a favor to the city, and I remember he said, maybe you'd be interested in coming over to Manchester and being city attorney. And I declined that invitation, but it was kind of fascinating to have the offer.
Well, let's talk about the business aspect of your practice for just a bit. How did that go?
Well, I did okay. I mean, I had a lot of great clients. I represented at one time or other probably every car dealer in the city, even though I rode a bicycle to work for 50 years. And the law part I felt comfortable. I was never real good at the billing part of it, despite the last 30 years, Dan Hofel telling me many times a month, Peter, you don't charge enough. You wrote the damn book and you don't charge as much as half the lawyers in Portsmouth, which I never really did well. And I think I mentioned to you the story, and I wasn't very, in terms of discounting bills was one of my specialties, I think, and or no charging. An example of my perhaps not so great business practice was I had some university professor who was on a board, and I had appeared before the board, and a couple years later he had some property issue, an apartment that he owned or something, and needed help, so he came to me, and I represented him, and we got a good result. And I remember having a discussion with my assistant about charging him. I said, I don't think he has very much money. I think we got to discount this bill. I don't think he has much money. And so we discounted probably 75%. And then several years later, I had a client come in, and he said, look, my office is at Strawberry Bank, and he's looking, the last time I was at Strawberry Bank, it was for the memorial service for this professor. I said, oh, I didn't even know he died. He said, they had to have it at Strawberry Bank because this was the only place large enough where they could display all of his Lamborghinis. And I said, well, maybe he could have afforded to handle that bill.
Well, this segues us to your practice manual experience, which I talked about a bit in the introduction. So describe that to us. How did you get involved with writing practice manuals, and how did that then go?
It was just as serendipitous as most of my practice in my life, in that at the midwinter bar meeting in 1986, I was with Michael Donahue, and there was we drove over, and he said, hey, there's a reception for Charlie de Grand Prix for his new book, and at the Wayfarer, and where all the old bar things were, a lot of them. And so we went, and so it's a big crowd, and we in a small room, and we got separated. Anyway, we meet up again, we bump into Charlie de Grand Prix, Chuck Douglas, and I want to say Peter Thompson. I don't know if Peter or the other, there were two Thompson sons. From Equity Publishing, which published we published the practice series and published the New Hampshire reports and volume and statutes. And we're talking with him, congratulating Charlie on his book, and Mike says, I've been after Peter to write the municipal law volume. And so Peter Thompson said, and then Chuck Douglas and Charlie de Grand Prix both said, oh yeah, Peter, you're the guy that should do it. And so Peter Thompson said, have you ever thought about it? I said, no. He said, well, why don't you submit an outline? I'd like to look. Anyway, I submitted an outline, and long story short, we went up and signed a contract, and he said, Peter, by agreeing to write this, you're committing to a lifetime of supplements. But the good news is you won't lose as much money on the supplements as you lose in the main volume. And he was right about that, although they all were pretty, it was not financially, it was not a great windfall. It took me 4 years to write it, and eventually the routine I get into, I would arrive at work at 6 every day and work till 11 writing. And then I would go running with the guys, and then I cut my practice. I didn't take any new clients on for 4 years. And my oldest son was 9, I think. So I figured I had a little window before I would be into college tuitions. And it was financially a disaster. I mean, it just, it was, and then the supplements continue to be. I did just finish my last supplement for volumes 15 and 16, but it was, in fact, when we first did it, when I first went up and met with Peter Thompson, he said, I don't know that there's enough for one volume in the practice series. They did another series that Dick Galway's book on workers' comp was in at the time. He said maybe, and I think the practice series was running 500 to 700 pages, and this one maybe 100 or 200. So I started sending chapters in, and he said after a year or so, I think there's enough for one volume in the practice series, and then I kept sending chapters in. He said, I think there's enough for 2 volumes. Well, it turned out there were enough for 4 volumes. And but anyway, it was not particularly planned, and I guess I'm glad I did it, but it was not financially.
Well, it was very significant for the New Hampshire bar, and you stopped your active private practice in 2020, but you have continued your work supplementing these very important practice manuals.
Now, whether I do, how much longer I do that, I don't know. But as of last week, I sent the last 2 volumes to Lexis.
Well, let's talk about some of the things that you've done outside of just your legal practice, and we'll start with the Pease Development Authority. Talk to me a bit about that and your involvement with that.
Well, Pease closed as a Strategic Air Command base in 1999. Legislature created the Pease Development Authority, and the state had 4 appointments, and Portsmouth had an appointment, and Newington had an appointment, and jointly they had an appointment. And I had worked for both towns, and both communities didn't always see eye to eye on a lot of things, and for some reason they both were able to agree on me. And it's probably sort of a lifetime appointment, because they probably weren't going to agree on something else, or someone else in a hurry. So that's I ended up on the board, and I was on it for 31 years, and it was a great experience. It was great people to work with, and it turned out pretty well, I think.
Most of the time as vice chairman, right?
Yes, yes.
And what kind of work was being done by that authority at that time, over the years?
Responsible for redeveloping the land and the airstrip, and I think it's pretty much regarded as the most successful base redevelopment project in the United States. And I mean, there were, I forget how many thousands of jobs out there, very diversified employment base, and a lot of great companies, and it's just turned out very, very well.
And you're no longer with the authority at this point, right?
Right. It's just, I think, I mean, obviously, I guess I am bragging, but I think people that see it, think, hey, this is a pretty nice place, and I like to think, I like to think that I played a little role in the environmental way that it developed, and in the beginning, I know the board would always look to me to make some comment about the environmental impact of what we should be doing, how we make something better or whatever. And I suspect in the beginning they would probably rolling their eyes, saying, "Oh, what's Peter going to say now?" And but maybe after 10 years, Bill Bartlett, who dreamed up this legislation, who was became chairman at some point, and he and I had kind of a rocky relationship in the beginning, but we came to really, really respect and love each other. And anyway, we're at a meeting, we're talking about something, and everybody sort of looked for me to say something about the environmental impact, or something like that. And I didn't say anything, and Bill said, "You know, for years we've all told Peter we thought he was crazy, and now we all sound just like him." So I thought that was a victory.
Now you had a farm, or have a farm.
I have a 7-acre tree farm right in Portsmouth.
And that's another thing you do.
I do.
And what's involved with that?
Well, years ago, we started planting. I started planting, and the year we bought our home in '72, I didn't have any trees on the lawn, on the yard, and so I dug, I think, 5 trees out of the fields or woods or someplace, and planted 2 on my property, and gave 3 to a neighbor. And next year I planted another couple and gave, let's say, 8 to a neighbor, and or neighbors. And I started planting them around the city on street trees. And by the end, we probably stopped 15 years ago, but I planted maybe 700 trees around the city. And then so I got a chance. family let me use this land not far from my house, but they didn't want to sell it to me at the time, and but I wanted to be able to raise the trees for the street trees, so I had several hundred street trees which I raised, and then I started at the same time planted Christmas trees, and so we had, I don't know, initially 300 or 400, 500, I don't know. And when the kids was in high school, they sold the Christmas trees, and I still have, I probably have 800 or 900 Christmas trees
So you still have this farm?
Still have the farm.
What's the name of the farm?
Well, I guess it's the Loughlin Tree Farm.
Okay.
And
And where's it located?
It's about a mile from Market Square in Portsmouth, if you can picture 7 acres. Most people don't have any idea that it's there, and so we used to sell them, and then years ago, Nancy and I both had some medical issues that were kind of just sobering, and we said, I remember saying, we're riding to Boston to one of Nancy's appointments and saying, so many people are so nice to us, why don't we start giving the trees away? And so we have a list that we send out to neighbors and friends and every year, and come and cut a tree. So it's kind of a tradition that keeps going.
So let's talk about your family just for a bit. So your wife, Nancy, she passed away a few years ago.
16 months ago, yesterday actually.
And her work was what?
She had been a teacher, and then she became a textbook editor, and then was a nourisher, that's not the right word, nurturer for our 3 boys and half the city, I think.
So you had 3 boys.
Yeah.
They're all grown up and moving along in their directions.
Right.
And what are their names?
Brendan is the oldest.
Yep.
He's in, and Garrett's the second oldest. They're both in Northern Virginia, and Connell is the youngest, and he's in Portsmouth, and we have 6 grandchildren.
So let's briefly talk about the honors that people have given you over the years. What's the honor that you're most proud of?
You asked me that. I don't know. Be truthful. I got a few of them, and I honestly, and I'm not being being humble, but on every one of them, when I got it, I looked out and I'd say, I could see 10 people that I thought should have gotten it ahead of me. And then I think, and I mentioned to you that when Nancy and I had this diagnosis that that I had a limited amount of time left, I think that triggered some awards that people said, well, he's going to be dead, so let's give him an award.
Well, I'm just going to list some of them. You got the Eileen Foley Citizenship Award from the City of Portsmouth. You got the Thomas More Award from the Catholic Lawyers Guild. You got the Rockingham County Professionalism Award. You got the Paul Harris Medal from the Portsmouth Rotary. And you got the Vicki Bunnell Award from the New Hampshire Bar Association. Those are all prestigious and important honors that recognize you.
They were all pretty good. It was great to get them. It was great.
Now, I'm going to talk to you about, as we're ending this interview, a little bit about your perspectives. First, let's talk about Portsmouth itself. This is a city that you were born in, lived in, still living in there. You've seen it change for good and for bad. Tell us about that.
I think it's been for good.
Okay.
And I know some people, maybe my age, think, oh, remember it used to be this and that. Well, it's still pretty special. And then there's one section of the downtown, a couple of sections of Route 1 bypass has changed, but on all of the major entrances into Portsmouth, you're in a residential area that hasn't changed dramatically in the last 50 years. And then all of a sudden you're downtown with all the red brick buildings. Now, in the north end, there are a lot of new hotels. Okay, but the core of Portsmouth is still the same, and the neighborhoods have I mean, it changed a little bit, but it's still very special.
And Strawberry Bank is there.
Strawberry Bank is there.
And historical preservation is
Yeah.
still going on.
Yeah, I know. I, in full disclosure, I represented a lot of the hotels that came to Portsmouth, but I just think it's very vibrant, and it was always very nice. But when the shipyard would have a slowdown, it would be difficult. But it's very vibrant now, and I think it's great.
So now let's talk about the law itself and perspectives. You've been a lawyer since the late 1960s. So how, in your mind, has the law changed over the years in New Hampshire?
I'm not sure that I have a good perspective on that. And I was thinking about changes in whether there were dramatic changes in municipal law. I mean, the Simplex case and some things like that. But and maybe I was trying to think why maybe that is that because I've been doing the supplements every year since 1990, that I've had to read every Supreme Court case and every piece of legislation. So it's been incremental, seeing the changes, and so I don't have a sense of some giant change that's happened in the law that I'd say, oh, well, that's.
Well, let's talk about the practice of law. Do you think that's changed at all over the years?
I mean, in terms of
lawyers dealing with one another, courts, judges?
I don't, for the last 2 or 3 years, this whole business now of pleading by electronically, and I don't know how to do that, and so that you don't have the contact that you had, and I would miss that. The going to the clerk's office and where the people were so nice and keen and here, and I'm not sure that it's much more efficient dealing with Zoom meetings and electronically, but I think and it's not anybody's fault, but that you miss some of the collegiality. It was just even any meetings that you go to that you used to sit down every month with somebody and you'd find something in common with them, and now if it's only occasionally, if it's done electronically, you don't have that opportunity. Now that's across the board, not just lawyers, but.
Well, we have many more lawyers than was the case when you were first starting out, right?
Yeah, and I know when I first started out, there were a fraction of the lawyers there are now, and people say, oh, it's terrible, there's so many lawyers now. This is like 1970, and we're still saying that. I'm not saying, but people say, oh, there's so many lawyers. Well, okay, live with it. Get with it. I mean, deal with it.
Well, let me ask you this. If you were advising a young lawyer beginning their practice, his or her practice now, what kind of advice would you give?
I don't know. I mean, I would still, if the question was, should I go to law school, the question is the finances, whether, that investment, which is a different calculus than existed when I was in law school, when I could pay for most of it by working construction in the summers. But I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do, and I thought law school would give me a lot of options, which it does to this day. And if you take out the financial calculations, I still think it's a great training. To me, law school is like a trade school, and very practical. You're learning stuff that you can use every day, and so I would encourage that. Again, not dealing with the financial part of it, but I don't think I have any magic advice and say, be nice to other people, something like that. Do good and avoid evil. I don't have any great social statement to make about what I would say to a.
Do you think that the law profession plays a major role in our society in a good way?
Yes.
And
Yes.
why is that?
And I suspect that I think we're gifted with abilities to deal with many different situations, and training that's helpful. And we always probably focus on things that don't go well, or some things that aren't the way most of us might see them. And these are very difficult partisan times, but I think the lawyers, and I wouldn't have thought this, 50 years ago. Even when I first started, when I was in law school, and when I first started practicing, I thought, I'm never going to be chummy with a lawyer on the other side. I'm going to represent my client, and I soon realized that's crazy. I mean, I'm Mr. Collegiality maybe, and I just one of the things I was kind of proud of is I had a case probably 6 or 7 years ago now, with maybe it's more than that, but Malcolm McNeil did a lot of land use stuff, so we were on opposite sides a lot. At one point, I was representing a car dealer. He was representing abutters opposing me in Portsmouth. He represented some abutters in Madbury. I represented the town. He represented a developer in Hampton. I represented the town. And we're banging heads over a period of a year on each of these cases. And then Malcolm had an issue with the town of Durham, and he hired me to represent him. I thought, well, that's kind of a neat thing about this practice in New Hampshire, that you're fighting like heck and not giving an inch, but you can get along and work with someone or for someone.
Well, I know I've been a colleague of yours on the Inns of Court and enjoyed that a lot, and the collegiality involved in that, and I know that you have enjoyed that as well.
Very much.
And one of the great things about our law profession is that collegiality, and certainly that's wonderful, and you've been a big part of it.
Well, thank you.
So Peter, I think we're concluded. Do you wish to say anything else, or we covered pretty much everything?
I think you've exhausted my entire knowledge about everything, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.
You stay well.
Judge. Thank
See
you,
ya.
too.
Okay.